After the Steiners break up at Super Brawl in February of '98, Buff is going to wrestle Rick at a few house shows and then continues the feud in tag matches. Buff is going to team with Scott in a losing effort against Rick Steiner and Lex Luger at Spring Stampede '98. Then he reunites with Scott Norton to defeat Rick and Luger on an April 22nd episode of Thunder after Scott hits Rick with a chair. But that's not the big story. Right before Scott interferes, Rick comes off the second rope with a bulldog on Buff, but Buff's head gets loose and rather than being driven into the mat, smashes into Rick's back as Rick hits the mat. And Buff has several vertebrae damaged here and develops spinal shock. It's a scary moment that shut down the live program. I remember watching this. I remember exactly where I was. I thought we were seeing something very serious. It was clear this was not part of the show. You were there. What was going through your mind as you see this happening on live TV?
Go back and watch what happened with DeMar Hamlin a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
That was essentially the vibe in WCW backstage at that point. We didn't know. It looked horrible. In Hamlin's case, it was horrible. He actually died on the field and he was brought back, I guess. But with Buff, we weren't in fear of his life, but we were afraid he was paralyzed from the neck down, because that was he was in that particular moment that you're describing. He was. We didn't know if he'd ever be able to walk again, or even wheel himself around in a wheelchair again. It was very scary. Very.
It was I don't know, man. I remember all of my friends talking about it the next day at high school. Like, we had never seen anything like this in wrestling before, or I hadn't. The Observer had this.
I hadn't either. It was a first for me.
After being transferred to a hospital in Atlanta the next day, he underwent lengthy neck and spinal surgery on April 27th to fuse the C3 and C4 vertebrae together, and also the C5 and C6 vertebrae together. He had some serious complications later that evening coming out of surgery with his esophagus, which led to his blood pressure dropping drastically and him being in danger of going into a life threatening coma. At press time the next day, Bagwell was listed in stable condition. The doctor prognosis was that given his age, 28, and his level of physical conditioning, the odds are that he'll make a nearly full recovery and would be able to return to the ring. Although the timetable is expected to be 6 months before he can return to training and 1 year before he can actually return to the ring. Bagwell was also told that the injury was 3 centimeters away from being a duplicate of the injury suffered by Christopher Reeve, which would have rendered him paralyzed for life, and that his strong musculature helped save him. However, the muscles probably worked against him in the surgery because the surgeons would have had to cut through far more muscle than the average person in order to address those neck problems. That, in hindsight, is what I think everybody was thinking. We didn't touch on it just yet, but the Christopher Reeve incident, and maybe you don't remember that name, but this is a guy who played Superman in the movies and through a horse accident had become paralyzed. The idea that we had our former Superman now in a wheelchair was unfathomable to think about. And that was at the top of, I think, everyone's mind when they saw what was happening to Bagwell here. Boy, I hope this isn't another Christopher Reeve situation.
Yeah, I can only speak for myself. I don't know what other people were thinking. For me, I never even got that far. I was so focused on what I saw in front of me and what I thought was a permanent situation that I didn't compare it to anything else or hope it wasn't something else. I only saw what I saw. And, I went to see Bagwell the next day or maybe 2 days afterwards in the hospital, and Bagwell's, spirits were up then, and kind of sense that he was out of the woods in terms of permanent injury and paralysis, but it was still scary. There was still the unknown. He had a long ways to go before he was out of the woods.
The other thing we got to address is how tough it must have been to carry on the broadcast. You know, on the one hand, you're doing all you can from a professional medical standpoint to take care of Buff. On the other hand, you don't necessarily want to exploit it. But you had a show that was formatted that did not involve, all right, we're going to just stop everything and we can't do anything in the ring for a while. So you're having to really sort of freestyle. And Meltzer would say at this point, Tony Schiavone basically took over the broadcast, and it was a very unique situation as you had paid wrestling shills put in a strange position of a legitimate potential tragedy going on right before their eyes, while at the same time being in the position of arguably not wanting to waste valuable television time without hyping the major storyline in the company involving Hulk Hogan. What made the situation doubly unique is two of the three announcers in the booth at the time, Shivani and Heenan, have both undergone serious neck surgeries in recent years. So that's an unwinnable, really tough spot for someone like Tony Schiavone here because this is not part of the program. And we've got to sort of walk the line of real life and wrestling fiction. That's a tough job for Tony here, is it not?
Tough for Tony, even tougher for Bobby.
Yeah.
Bobby was he was hypersensitive. And, he had a right to be, right? He'd gone through it. He knew it. But he was also pretty fragile. And oftentimes I'd put him outside of the ring. And there was, a lot of extracurricular activity. And we've seen, scenes that we've discussed before in 83 Weeks where Bobby reacted in a very real way to even the potential of something happening that would further injure an already injured neck with Bobby Heenan. And Tony's a great human being. Tony Schiavone is a great human being. Tony has a heart. Tony has a high degree of empathy. And to have to sit and the show must go on, I'm sure it was hard for Tony, but I think it was even harder for Bobby because it was just so much more personal. Tony's had his own issues. You hang around Tony to the say, if you over to a side of Tony, you say, hey, Tony, he doesn't turn his head, he turns his body. And there's a reason for that. So Tony also was firsthand knowledge, right? Tough situation, no doubt about it, especially when there's a lot of things you don't know.
Meltzer was really complimentary and said that he didn't think that Shivani and Heenan could have done a better job, but we're trying to just do what we can. And he sort of freestyles that maybe you were concerned about sharing too much of the real life potential danger or injury. Was there some sort of an edict or discussion made by you or passed on to anyone about what to share or not to share during that process?
No, it's just that we didn't know.
Yeah.
Dave is very inclined to share and discuss and print as fact what he doesn't know. That's the nature of what Dave has made a career of. I wasn't so inclined to come out and disclose a lot of information that I didn't have.
Right.
I didn't know. I think it would have been inappropriate, to be honest. And you also have to consider, what does the talent want?
Right.
I couldn't have a conversation about Marcus and, hey, Marcus, do you mind if we just tell the world what just happened to you and what the prognosis may or may not be? Even though you don't know, I know you're on the stretcher and they're taking you out to the ambulance, but how about we stop and have a little chat so we can figure out how best to present this to the audience? I couldn't do that. And without having a little bit of input from the talent, I would not be inclined to share information, even if I was comfortable with it or knew it, without first talking to the talent, because now you're talking about their lives and the rest of their lives. It's not a storyline. It's not just a wrestling thing. This is potentially someone who may never be able to brush his own teeth again. Do we want to share that with the audience? No, I wouldn't. Dave would. Dave would, but I wouldn't.